My name is Pete. We're going to talk about interviewer skills. The whole goal of the workshop or the session today is really focused on you as an interviewer. So if you're here hoping to learn how to kind of be in an interview as the candidate, this is probably not the right place. And this is also going to be focused really on being just somebody in a company who has to give an interview, not the person who's designing the interview process or picking the interview questions necessarily. So that's going to be the focus today, but we'll get right into it. But feel free to just raise your hand and ask questions in the middle. There'll be a bunch of time for questions at the end, but if we take them in the middle and irrelevant, that's fine too. So yeah, and if that wasn't what you were looking for in a conference talk, if you were really looking for being the candidate, then feel free to find your way out. I won't be offended. All right, well, so first of all, why is this so important? Interviewer skills, so I've worked at a bunch of different companies, we'll talk about that in a minute, but interviewer skills, in my opinion, are one of the things that is exacerbating the talent shortage that we've heard about everywhere, right? Not hiring quality candidates because your interviewers don't know how to get the signal that they need to understand whether that person is going to be a good fit or not, is really challenging, and it can make your hiring processes take longer. It can lead to you not hiring the best people that you can find, and I think it's something that's overlooked. We talk a lot about, oh, there aren't enough people in the industry, there aren't enough this, there aren't enough that, but we really ignore the fact that in many of these hiring decisions, we'll talk to 5, 10, 15, 20 people, and probably many of them could come in and do the job well, and we're either being too picky or we don't know how to understand that they're really good candidates. So, so that's, I think, why this is so important. And what I've found is that engineers in general, and I think this probably extends outside of engineering, but I don't have personal experience there. I think engineers in general are not as good at interviewing as they think they are when they first start. But it's a skill that can be learned, right? And so hopefully this will, if you all are just now getting on that journey, hopefully this will be a good start. And if you're already somewhere along the way, then hopefully we teach you something. Can folks in the back hear me? Okay, thank you. So my name's Pete. I live here in Atlanta. My wife, my daughter, a couple dogs, and I've been in tech. The Gen Z talks about the late 1900s. Well, I've been in tech since then. So, and we're not going to talk about how much younger I look in that photo. We'll just skip right on over that. And currently, I'm the Vice President of Engineering and Optimal Dynamics. We are a logistics analytics company based in New York. Come see me afterwards if you want to talk about that. And why should you listen to me specifically? That's a really great question. I've led engineering hiring at 5 different companies, and I've conducted hundreds of interviews, that's probably a low estimate, and trained dozens and dozens of interviewers at those companies. This is something that I feel really strongly about. I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I've seen really good results from people who do that sort of practice to get better at being interviewers. So hopefully we'll get some of that out of the way today. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what is an interview for. That might seem really obvious, but I think it's probably good to level set. We'll talk about preparing for an interview. What should you be doing before the interview? How should you arrange your time? Tips for conducting the best possible interview once you're in the room with the candidate, or I guess on Zoom these days. And then evaluating the signals that you got, and we'll obviously have some time for Q&A at the end. Some things we're not going to talk about. Already talked about these a little bit, but how do you design an interview process? Could be its own conference. How do you select interview questions? If any of you are in a situation where you have to pick your own interview questions to go interview candidates, let me know and we can maybe talk about that a little bit at the end. That's terrifying, by the way. And then we're not going to talk about why you should never ever use coding interviews. I've actually given a whole conference talk on that and would be happy to give it again if you want to hear it out in the hallway. And then what specific answers or signals to look for in an interview, so we won't talk about individual questions, right? This is a good answer, this is a bad answer. And we're not going to get into a deep discussion of bias in interviews, interviewers, or methods. I'm not an expert in that, and there are a bunch of experts here, so probably just going to stay in my lane on that one. So what even is an interview, right? Well, let's first talk about what the goal of a hiring process is, of which an interview is like one part, right? The goal of a hiring process is to identify as efficiently as possible a candidate to fill the role. So that's not necessarily the best candidate. It's not necessarily the perfect candidate. It is a good candidate, somebody who can come in, do the job, ramp up as quickly as you need them to ramp up. And I think sometimes we miss this in interviews. Like, oh, well, this person doesn't know everything. They don't know this or they don't know that. Cool, but could you teach them that? Could they learn it? Is it really critical that they know it on day one? Sometimes it is, and many times it's not. So understanding that the goal of the hiring process is to hire somebody, right? It's not necessarily to hire the best possible person in the entire universe, but somebody who's good, somebody who will be a good addition to your team and who can come in and do the work. So in that context, what's the goal of an individual interview session? This is, I think, where sometimes people, when they first start interviewing, get a little twisted up. The goal of your interview, in most cases, is not to make a decision about whether or not to hire that person. The goal is to provide signal to whoever is the decision maker, which will sometimes be you in a group, it will sometimes be the hiring manager, but it's to provide signal to that person or those people so that they can make a decision with the totality of the signals that they're getting from all of the interview sessions. And so this, I think, should help lower the stress for most interviews, right? Because you don't have to make the decision. You just have to go talk to this person for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, and tell people what you saw. Like, what happened? Like, did they know things? Did they not know things? What were they good at? What were they not good at? And you don't necessarily, in most cases, have to make the decision based on that. And I think this also helps as you are going through post-syncs or talking with your team after you've interviewed somebody. Somebody has to put all of that evidence together and make a decision about a candidate, but it's probably not going to be you most of the time as just an individual interviewer. The one exception to this is your company and you personally probably have deal breakers, right? HR type violations, people who say or do things in interviews that are inappropriate. That's like something that should be raised very quickly and usually can derail an entire hiring process for somebody. So in the absence of those sorts of things, probably you're just given some signal, you're just given some information. Hey, I talked to this person, this is what I learned. Maybe they had a bad day, maybe they didn't, who knows, but this is what I saw. So the next thing to understand about interviews is that they are always going to be proxies. How many people are familiar with proxy measures? Okay, here and there. So a proxy measure is a measure of something that you're trying to figure something else out and you can't measure it directly, so you measure this other thing instead to see what you think about that. That's what an interview is, right? You are not actually giving people real world work as much as you might think you are. An interview is always going to be a proxy, and that is because interviews create anxiety that doesn't exist for most people in a workplace. They have arbitrary time constraints. It's very uncommon in software engineering to be handed a task and told, do this in 45 minutes right now. Sometimes it happens, but really uncommon. You will not have as much context in an interview as you're going to have in your real job, hopefully. There's an information asymmetry in interviews that exists between the interviewer and the candidate that is not common in the actual workplace. Usually if you have those information asymmetries at your real job, you share your information and then everybody's on the same page. And then there are incredibly strong power dynamics in an interview that usually don't manifest at workplaces. It is very uncommon, in my experience, for a software engineer to be doing work with their boss looking over their shoulder and saying, if you don't get this right in 45 minutes, you're fired, right? Like, really uncommon. But that's basically what an interview is, right? Like, hey, like, if you don't do well in this interview for 45 minutes, no job for you. And so that just completely ruins any attempt that you might be making to make it like the real world, right? It doesn't happen. So understand that we will always be talking about proxy measures, and sometimes it's difficult to figure out how does this performance that the person did in this interview measure, like how does that relate to what they'll do in the real world? There's some research out there that talks about how coding interviews specifically measure performance anxiety more than they measure the skill of the person doing the coding. And that's where this proxy talking too long, got it. So that's where this proxy measure concept comes in. And as long as you understand that this is a proxy, as long as you understand that what you're doing is you're doing the best you can to figure out something that nobody can really know, how will this person do once they get to this company, you can kind of adjust for that. So let's talk about what your job is as an interviewer. So your job is to determine what signals you're looking for and spend as much time as possible getting those signals, right? You're going to have 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and it can just fly by if you have a candidate who is just really verbose. You ask them one very question, what did you do this weekend? And 30 minutes later, they're done telling you about how their dog can jump off of docks into oceans or whatever. So it's really important that you have good time management and that you are focused on getting information and signal, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that in a minute. And then the second thing that I think people sometimes overlook is you've got to provide a good candidate experience so that when that interview is done, people still want to work with you, right? I can't tell you the number of times I've hopped into a technical screen and they've been like, okay, let's get right to it. And I'm like, hi? It's nice to meet you. Like, how was your day? Like, I don't know. So making sure that you understand that throughout the process, whether it's the first screen or whether it's the final interview, understanding that like providing a good experience is really, really important. So one other thing that I'll note here is that I've read a lot of interview post syncs, like, Greenhouse. I don't know how many of you have actually done interviews, but you'll usually go and type up a summary of your interview after the fact. The number of times I've seen an interviewer say, oh, I didn't get good signal on that. That is an admission that you didn't do a very good job as an interviewer, because it's your job to get signal. The candidate doesn't know what they're supposed to be telling you. They don't know what you're looking for. If you're doing a coding interview, they don't know, are you looking for speed? Are you looking for accuracy? Are you looking for testing? Are you looking for an iterative development cycle? They don't know what you're looking for. And so unless you either, first of all, you can tell them, but they still are not going to know what's really important to you, right? Because interviews can feel very gamey, right? Oh, well, you're telling me this, but is that what you really mean, kind of a thing. So I didn't get good signal on that. It's fine to say it if it's true, right? But it should be something that you look at when you write that and you go, ooh, okay, let me think about how next time in this situation I can get that signal. And that's something that if you're struggling with in a particular circumstance, like talk to somebody who has done more interviews than you, talk to your manager. It might be an artifact of the way the interview is set up or the question. It could just be that you didn't know how to manage an answer a candidate had, or you didn't know how to understand it. I was in an interview one time shadowing where the interviewer and the interviewee were just talking completely past each other because one of them had done web his entire career and the other one had only done client-server programming. And so he was asking this question like, oh, hey, how do you figure out when the upload is successful? And she had no idea what he was talking about. Because client-server, it's just, well, when the connection, you just know, like it's inherent. So being able to talk to somebody else when you have those struggles can help you become a better interviewer. All right, so that's kind of what an interview is and the basics and what are you trying to look for. So now let's talk about what do you have to do to get ready for an interview. Your manager said, hey, I need you to go talk to this person. You're going to be interviewing them Wednesday afternoon to talk about whatever. So what should you do? First things first, check your calendar, right? Make sure that you have some time before the interview to put yourself in the right mind frame. Make sure that you're on time. Review the person's resume, maybe. We'll see that in just a second. And then clear some time afterwards to make sure that you can absorb the notes that you wrote, write a good summary for everybody else. The longer you wait after an interview to write down your notes and give them to everybody else, the less fidelity there will be between your notes and what actually happened. So trying to clear time on either side. If you're in management, this can be really tricky, but it's also really important, especially if you're relatively new to interviewing. As you're getting better at taking notes and as you get better at this, you can maybe trim these down or delay them, but making sure your calendar is all set. Read the job description. That will be one of the very few things that you and the candidate can have in common, that you both know. And you might be surprised at some of the things you find in the job description, even for a role that is adjacent to yours, that you know very well. You might be like, oh, I had no idea that we were looking for this particular skill. And that could be because the team is looking for a new skill. It could be because HR wrote the job description and they didn't really check with engineering or whatever it happens to be. But read the job description. So,
2 questions. One,
yeah.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Second question. How do you ensure that you understand the job description the same way that the interviewee understands the job?
Oh, yeah, you're totally not gonna. Yeah. So I think the big thing is for you to understand it as accurately as you can to what the company really needs. And if there's something in it that's weird.
Right. I mean, like, how do you assess, or what is your suggestion for assessing that the interviewee? Because a lot of us work for, we have Spotify out there, we have Google out there, we have Warner Media out there. Yeah. So there's a lot of people who want to work for that company.
Yeah.
They see a job, they can do that. How do you suss out that they understand what that job is compared to how you understand?
I see. So how do you understand that the candidate understands the job?
Versus, because a lot of, as I said, a lot of times they may want to just be at Google.
Yeah.
So I'm going to grab this job.
Yeah.
I don't quite understand what they do.
Yeah, I don't know that I've got a good answer for that. I don't worry about it too much. Okay. I know that my job is to go into that interview and ask them questions to figure out whether they have the skills they need to join the company. And if they don't understand the job description, that's probably pretty common, actually. Whether they read it or not, often there are some misunderstandings based on their experience. So, yeah. Next thing to look for is any training materials that your company provides. If you're using Greenhouse or some other applicant tracking system and they've got it set up really well, you might have a list of questions that you're supposed to ask. Just make sure you're reviewing all of the materials and also any documentation you have for the actual interview session. I've worked at companies that have had elaborate documentation about how to give every question. Go read that stuff. And if it's been a while since you've given that session, go read it again, even if you've read it before. And if you've never given this particular interview session before and you have time, doing a dry run can be really, really valuable, especially if it's something like a coding interview. Yeah.
I noticed you don't have read their resume on here. Is that also do you recommend not reading it or always reading it, or depending on the type of interview?
Yeah, so the question is, I don't have read their resume on here. Why is that? It was actually a quirk of editing on my part on this slide. However, I think it's a little tricky because reading people's resume can bring bias in. So I think that the main thing that you should be thinking about before you read somebody's resume is this information going to be relevant to me in this interview? So if you're just doing a coding interview, you probably don't need to read it. If you are doing an interview, you ask them about the job that they're in or the role. One of the questions that I love to ask is tell me about a project you've worked on before that's complicated, whatever. Reading their resume to try to figure out what that project might be ahead of time can be really valuable. In general, though, I think that if you have no affirmative reason to read the resume, maybe just skip it. You can ask them to tell you about themselves. They're going to do a better job than reading the resume anyway. So, but yeah, you can definitely have a situation where you bring somebody in and somebody who has Google on their resume gets benefited out and somebody who has some company you've never heard of doesn't, and that's not necessarily where you want to be. I personally think that the amount of bias that brings in is relatively small if you're doing all of these other things well, but I think it's a toss-up as to whether or not that's a good idea in any particular scenario. Okay, so every interview you should have a short 3, 4, maybe 5 things that you're trying to get out of it. Skills, traits, knowledge. It should be fairly clear what those things are. This person needs to be able to make good trade-offs when they're doing system design, or they need to be able to debug this code really easily. Whatever it is, whatever your signals are, write them down. Sometimes your company will give them to you, but if you're in a situation where it's just hey, go talk to this person and figure out if they're good, write down what you're looking for. Even if that's not exactly what the whole interview process is trying to find, if that's not written down for you somewhere, writing them down yourself will help you be clear about what questions you're asking and will help you understand whether or not the answer the person is giving you in the moment is actually giving you the signals that you're looking for. It's really good if that's given to you by your company, but I've been at many companies that haven't gotten there yet, and so you'll just be sent in to be oh, go figure out if this person is technical enough. Well, what does that even mean? If nobody will answer that for you, come up with that list yourself and just kind of stick to it throughout the interview. So once you're in the actual interview, is where kind of the rubber meets the road here. So the first thing is be a person, right? Like I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, like you're a person, they're a person. This is a pretty stressful situation. Jumping right into whatever it is without at least a little bit of pleasantry and a little bit of acknowledgement of like the humanness of the person, especially in Zoom, can be really jarring for people, and it can really set people on edge. So pretty important. Not gonna overdo this, but just say hello. Like ask them how their day is going. Like things like that. It can make a big difference to just say something like that rather than just being like, okay, let's start coding. Like, okay. And then take notes. This is actually one of the hardest things to do in an interview where you are by yourself. Two people in the interview room makes it a lot easier. You can take better notes when the other person is asking questions and vice versa. But if you're by yourself, this is going to take practice. But when you're taking notes, try to take notes about facts. What did they say? What did they do? What was the situation? Over conclusions. You'll remember the conclusions, right? If you see the fact, you will remember you thought that this person didn't know how to like read an error message or that they were really good at refactoring the code that they were looking at. You will probably not remember why you thought that a day later or an hour later. So write down facts, write down things that will trigger memories, but you'll remember conclusions. And then if you need to, when you're starting to learn how to take notes and you're learning how to manage the time of the interview, it is totally fine for you to pause and say, I'm just going to finish writing some notes for a couple of seconds. It's totally fine. It's a little awkward, but everybody's used to it. People who have done a lot of interviews are like, yep, no problem. I'll just sit here and stare at my Zoom screen for 10 seconds while you finish up writing. It's not a big deal. So now, when you are actually talking to people, looking for a signal, help the candidates, help them. When they're struggling, ceases to provide you signal. So if we're in a system design interview and I'm trying to figure out how, I'm trying to get somebody to tell me how they're going to solve a caching problem, if they're really not understanding it, it doesn't do you any good to sit there and watch them stare at their screen and try to figure it out, right? So help them, we'll talk about some strategies for that, but helping somebody in an interview is not a bad thing. They don't know what you're looking for, so help them out. And this is one of the hardest ones. Cut off candidates who are rambling or not answering the question that you are trying to figure out. Doing that kindly is a kindness because they are not helping themselves as they are rambling on about the thing that you weren't asking. It can be really, really challenging. I recommend practicing this. My strategy is pretty awkward, but I'm like, oh, hey, I'm sorry. I must not have asked that question very well. What I'm actually trying to figure out is X, Y, and Z. And you just have to interrupt them sometimes, right? Because people are nervous, they talk, whatever. So, but that takes practice, and I recommend just coming up with a script and reading the script until you get more into the flow of it. All right, so helping on technical screens. This is, I'm not going to cover all of this, but these are just some examples. So on coding exercises, syntax errors, it usually doesn't provide a lot of signal to watch somebody try to figure out where a semicolon goes. Like, there's a guy that I've worked with before, he's an amazing engineer. He will just space on where a semicolon goes. He just can't find it. Where's the missing semicolon? Somebody will come up and go, oh, it's right there. Go, oh man, I can't believe I didn't see that. So those errors, like if they give them a second and then just be like, oh, I think you're just missing a semicolon here, or oh, I think the syntax of the for loop is this. Logical errors, give them a little bit longer because you can kind of see the debugging process. What do they look at? What are they trying to figure out? But still, if they are banging their head against the wall and you're not learning anything from watching it, give them the answer and move on. And if you have any particular things that are like traps, there's a particular question that I've seen given at previous companies where going and using regexes is like the first thing people think of, and it is always a mistake in that particular interview. Just stop them. Just be like, hey, I've seen a lot of people try this. It never ends well. Like, feel free to go forward if you want to, but like, probably not the best idea. Like, it gets really messy really quick. That's totally fine. They don't know. System design. If they're stuck, like I mentioned, like propose your own solution and ask them what the trade-offs are. Like, hey, if we solved our caching problem this way, what would be the pros and cons of that? That's how it would work in a real job. right? Like if you were just talking to a colleague and you couldn't figure it out, you'd be like, oh, what do you think about this? And they'd be like, oh, well, that's good for this reason or that's bad for this reason. And if you give them a proposal and they have no idea, well, that's good signal, right? But it's not good signal to just, oh, well, they didn't have an idea. Oh, okay. Explain concepts they might not be familiar with. Don't let them flounder in areas they aren't strong in. So if you know that they're not a front-end dev and this is a full stack role, like push a little bit, but then, okay, cool. Move on to something that they know better. The idea here is like if you know somebody who is really good, like has really strong legs, and you give them one weight to lift, and it's like, oh, okay, you know that, and then they have really weak arms, and you give them like 40 weights to lift that are all too heavy for them, like you don't learn anything about how strong they are. If you flip that, you might figure out exactly how strong they are in their legs, and you're like, okay, well, pretty weak arms, no problem. I know that life. So, and then in code review type interviews, if they're not seeing something, just point it out and see what they think. Like, hey, what do you think about this? Like, I noticed this, and then role play as much as possible. So that, pretend you're the code author. Code review interviews, I don't know if any of you have done them. They're not super common, but they work way better when people are role playing. Otherwise, you get this weird meta, like, well, if I were reviewing this code, what I would think I would say is, you are reviewing the code, review it. Like, it's my code, like, let's talk about it. That makes things go a lot better. Any questions about specific things on helping people? This is, I think, is one of the trickier parts, knowing when to step in.
Will you have some time to kind of reverse this? Because we're also all going to be in areas where we're the interviewees. Mm-hmm. And at least I've been in scenarios where I wish that the interviewer had gone and seen you first.
Yeah.
Because like all of the questions are trick questions and things like that.
Yeah. Let me make sure that we get through the rest of this, and then we can come back to that at the end, if that's okay. Yeah.
And that first bullet point, like, what other things do you evaluate in coding exercise, or do you have any recommendations besides speed or testing?
My recommendation is don't do coding interviews. But if you're going to do them, what I really like to see in a coding interview, and I will tell people this up front, is I want to see, like, make a change and run it and see if it works. Like, make another change, run it, see if it works. I tell people, don't test just for this interview. Like, if you work because you're a test-driven developer, do that. Don't just write tests in this interview because you think that's what I want to see. So I think for coding interviews, and I think this works for all of them, I try to just tell people, this is what I'm evaluating you on. This is what we're looking for. If they don't know. If they don't know, how do they perform, right? And in a real job, hopefully you're going to tell them what you want them to do. So I think for a coding interview, I think it really depends why you're doing the coding interview. If it's because the person is straight out of code school and you want to make sure that they actually know how to program, that's a much different thing than if you're trying to figure out if somebody is a senior software engineer from their coding interview. So that one I think is a lot more specific. But I think just tell them. Whatever it is you come up with, just tell them and go from there. Cool. Okay, so now you've done the interview, you've helped the candidate along, you've gotten the signals. I want to go back and just say one thing that I don't know that I emphasize strongly enough is that time management in your interview. So I mentioned it with like interrupting people and like getting them back on track. That goes for every single part of your interview after you get out of like the initial phase of just chatting with them. Once you're actually in the evaluative part of the interview, if you are doing something, even if you're on script, that is not providing you signal, just move on. You do not have enough time to spend 10 minutes on something that's not giving you signal. And that's true even if this is like a really, like this question is really important. This candidate like has to, like, if they're not giving you good signal, move on to something else, because maybe that signal is going to get picked up in another interview and the candidate's going to understand it better and they're going to do a good job there and it won't matter. But if you spend 10 minutes on that and you still get nothing, then you have less time to learn everything else about them. So time management and like really being, and that's why writing those signals down up front is so important, so that you actually know when you're not getting what you need. All right, so after the interview, it is so important that you try to find some time to sit down with your notes and like really absorb what happened. It is very difficult to really experience the interview while you are trying to run it. That is a really hard thing to do. It takes a lot of practice. And even when you have a lot of practice, it's still hard. You still want to go back and look at your notes. Write up a good summary. A good summary, in my opinion, is very, very opinion-y right now, but a good summary of your interview should allow someone else to determine whether the candidate passed the interview without trusting your judgment. That, I think, is one of the critical parts about writing a summary after the fact. Give people facts. What did the person say? What problem did they struggle with? How did they struggle? What did they try? What didn't work? What did they do next? You don't need to write down everything they said or everything they did, but really focusing on giving people these scenarios so that somebody else can look and make an independent judgment about how the person did. That does two things for you. The first thing is it keeps you out of bias territory. It helps minimize the amount of bias that might be in your conclusion. It also allows you to figure out if you and the other people on your interview panel are aligned on what's important. If you just say this person can't code, and you determined that because they didn't see a semicolon that was missing, somebody else might look at that and go, so what? Like, they'll be using an IDE in this job. It'll tell them when the semicolon is missing. Like, why do we care about that? So getting to the actual facts is so, so important. Go light on the conclusions. Let the facts make the conclusions obvious. That's, I don't know. It's a writing tip I've gotten in a lot of other scenarios. It's true here too. And then, yeah, somebody should be able to evaluate it after the fact without relying on your judgment. You still want to give your judgment. You still want to make some conclusions, but they should be obvious. They should oh, okay, now that I've read all of these facts that the person gave me, of course this person is a great fit, or of course they're not. But you will find, I have found many times in my career that I have come to a conclusion that was different based on the same set of facts than somebody else did. And those are good conversations to have in the post-sync. And so often in the post-sync, you will have that. You will all sit down, you'll read your summaries, you'll talk about it, and then you'll have a discussion about whether, was this good, was this bad? And that'll be a good time to kind of suss out where these things are. Your discussions will go a lot better if you're focused on facts. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions on using a rubric? I've used that in the past, like a 1 to 5 rubric, so that way. What do you suggest with anything like this?
Yeah, so I think this depends. I think that if your company has a rubric, you should 100% follow it. And a rubric in this scenario is usually saying hey, we're looking for, that's like the company giving you the signals. These are the signals we're looking for. We want you to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, or we want you to, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever it is. Yes, 100% use those. Use your facts to inform what you're putting in the rubric, but I'm kind of assuming here that you may not have that, because that's one of the more sort of advanced interview loop kind of things that a company might have. Amazing, it's great. You need that. You need a rubric. And that's kind of when I talked at the beginning about coming up with your own list of signals. I'm kind of saying come up with your own rubric. If you don't have one, create one. If you have one that the company has given you, yes, by all means follow that, because that's what's bringing consistency to the interview process.
If you don't have one.
Yeah, if you don't have one, come up with one. Look at those signals. I don't love personally the 1 to 5 rating system. I would rather just talk about the skills and then see are those the skills we need? Can we teach them? Whatever. But that's, I think, a topic for a different day. All right. Yeah.
You talked a lot about helping out the candidates.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're trying to summarize, how do you make sure it wasn't just you giving them all the clues versus they were doing well?
Yeah. The question was, when you have to help the candidate, do you include that in your evaluation? Yes, I 100% do. It's not always a red flag. In a lot of scenarios, helping the candidate is you helping them understand what you're looking for or getting them unstuck. We all get stuck. I don't know, maybe some of you don't. I get stuck when I'm coding all the time. I get stuck in system design all the time. I'm usually doing it with colleagues, and so we help each other out. And so it's not, now some people are going to take a very dim view, oh, you had to help them, whatever. Try to think less about how much you had to help them and what they were able to accomplish with a little bit of help, because they're going to have help at their real job too, right? You're helping them. Now, if you're telling them, okay, type this and then type that and then type this and then type that, yeah, it's probably not a good fit. But if you're oh, hey, the syntax for this is this, or oh, you missed a small logical bug here, and then they're oh, yeah, okay, and now I'll fix it and figure it out. But yeah, do include it and include what they were able to do with that help. Yes?
So I wonder, so you mentioned before how people are really nervous when they are trying to like, you know, you're looking over their shoulder. And I know me, for example, if I am being interviewed, like I probably lose 80% of like my brain power. You know, like,
Yes.
I perform way, way, way worse. And then when I'm interviewing someone, I see that happening, but I don't know like how to. Do they actually not know, or is it because they're nervous? Like,
Yeah.
I guess that's just like our hard problem to solve. We tried to like just try to revamp the way we interview people. Like we don't do live coding challenges and stuff. But I just wonder how to judge that.
Yeah. Question is, how do you judge somebody's nervousness and how that's impacting their performance? It is a really hard question. I think you kind of have to know the person a little bit to know like how do you pull them out of it. One of the things that I like to do, and this is veering off a little bit, is talk about how do you like talking about things they've already done, right? Don't make them pull information out of thin air. Like, tell me about a project you worked on. Like, especially if you prep them for that question, like, hey, we're going to ask you about a project you worked on. Like, they'll have some time to think about it. They'll have some time to remember what they worked on, and that'll usually give you a better signal of how they actually work. But yeah, no, it's really hard. I don't have a good solution for you. Yes.
I guess I can try to answer your question because I'm a part of probably 60% of the interview process from HR screening all the way up to the live coding at the end. And one, I acknowledge that they're nervous. I think, like you said, people get in interviews and it was all technical problems. I've watched it happen time and time again. You can't open the team screen. You can't download it. You can't share your page.
Right.
And so I acknowledge it from the beginning. I'm like, look, you're nervous for no reason. You know, you're sitting in a room with me, the person you talked to 3 times, or on screen 3 times. You're not sitting with the person you had a text screen with and you had a great conversation. And 60% of our interview is not even visible. Like we have no visual portion to the end. And then also, I offer my candidates because for delivery style team members, we do a presentation. For technical team members, we do live coding. So I offer them the opportunity to do a dry run with me or to talk to me about some of the things that we're going to talk about, even if I don't understand everything from a technical standpoint. I give them the opportunity to drop 30 minutes on my calendar before their interview and go through that with me, because I can't tell you whether you're yes or no at the end of the day, but I know that other people will. So giving them an opportunity to do that dry run with somebody that they already feel comfortable with puts them in a position on the next, at the next interview, to do the best work that they can because we've already talked about it. And then it's not going to come down to they didn't have a great interview because they didn't do well. It's coming down to you really just don't have the level of skill that we're looking for. It's not nervousness anymore because you've done it. You've done it probably by yourself. You've now done it with me. And you just alleviate all the nervousness when you actually acknowledge what is making you nervous. So that's what I do.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Acknowledgement is like a good answer.
Yeah, and I think that also, that's a great answer. I think the more you can do in prep, and this gets into kind of how you structure the interview process, but the more you can do in prep to let people know what's coming will cut down on the amount of nervousness you see. Once you're in the room and they're nervous, though, it can be really hard to figure out what's going on. I see you. I have a couple more.
I don't do a live. I give them a week. I give them like a couple days or a week to do it on their own, and then we'll discuss the code afterwards.
Yeah. So when you're evaluating, a couple of recommendations I have. Look for reasons to hire somebody. Don't look for reasons not to. There are always reasons not to. Always, always, always. No matter how good the candidate is, you will always be able to find something that they didn't do well. Look for reasons to hire them. If you look and look and look and look and you're on the candidate side and you're really trying and you find like one reason to hire them, then maybe it's not a good fit. But you know, I think that looking on the bright side is going to, first of all, it's going to help you understand what are they going to bring to the team when they come. And the second thing is just you're going to get a much better view of the candidate that way. And then I wrote this originally as do not use feedback about tone and demeanor. But I think the real answer is like be really careful with critical feedback about tone, excitement, demeanor. You do not know this person. You do not know what their tone means. You do not know what their demeanor means. Obviously, do not accept rudeness. Do not accept people like belittling you. But like if somebody just doesn't seem excited in an interview, it doesn't matter. They're probably nervous or they think this is a job and they're just being very businesslike. It's also in this particular situation, it's really easy to judge women very harshly because they're not bubbly enough, where you wouldn't do the same for a man. And that's easy for any of us to do. And so just if you're thinking about saying, oh, this person didn't seem excited or they blah, 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 like just if it's not relevant, cut it out. If it wasn't something that was really important, just cut it out. It's probably not relevant. And you're probably going to, in your post sync, you're probably going to see a bunch of other people bringing that feedback anyway, so you'll get it either way. But I would just cut it unless it is really, really important. They were rude or they were really something that was off-putting, other than just oh, they weren't excited enough. And then set aside your gut reaction. As best you can, try to ignore the conclusions you came to, reread your notes, reread those facts that you wrote down, and try to put yourself in the shoes of your colleague sent you this list of notes and you're trying to give that person advice on should they say yes or no to this candidate. Try to ignore the thing that actually happened, just read your notes. And what you might find is that some vibe that you got or some gut reaction you had, when you actually read the notes, you're like, well, actually, this isn't as bad as I thought it was, or this is not as good as I thought it was. Just the raw notes of it have this particular outcome. And then check back in with yourself and see okay, does this change my opinion? Because I think that can be something that, lost it. Okay. That was the second to last slide. If you only remember 4 things, there we go. If you only remember 4 things from this talk, it should be these. Be crystal clear about what you're looking for in terms of signals. In the interview, avoid anything that doesn't generate signal. And then notes and summaries should be primarily fact-focused. And finally, the 4th one, interviewing is a skill and you get better from intentional practice. It doesn't mean just doing a bunch of interviews. It means doing the interviews, spending some time afterwards to think about how did that go? Were there questions I could have asked better? Are there things that I could have really improved on in that way? And that's it. That's the 4 things. Thank you.